There's the component of being able to hear differences in intonation, being able to hear if something is sharp or flat comparative to a reference pitch. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is knowing your instrument tendencies. My name is Dr. Natalie Law, and I am a professional bassoonist and teacher, and I love to help people just like you learn how to play the bassoon and improve your skills and feel confident playing this instrument. So if that's a topic of interest to you, make sure you're subscribed to the channel and give me a thumbs up if the video is helpful or at least interesting to you. Intonation it's something that really takes years to develop because there's so many components of it, right? There's the component of being able to hear differences in intonation, being able to hear if something is sharp or flat comparative to a reference pitch. So that's one aspect of it. Another aspect of it is knowing your instrument tendencies. So there are basically kind of two sides to this. In order to improve you hearing intonation better, which is so important because that's how you're able to diagnose issues with intonation. One thing that I do kind of on a daily basis is I practice with drones, and I do this in my warm-up routine. If you've watched any of my other videos on practicing, I often bring up my warm-up routine because it's something that I feel like really improves my bassoon playing in general. But when I'm doing my scales and arpeggios, I have a drone of the root pitch that I'm in. So if I'm playing scales in C major, I have a drone in C going on. And I like to use cello drones. I don't like to use like the synthesized drones that kind of come with like tuner apps and things, because I feel like cello drones they're easier to sort of listen to, and they're also more sort of realistic. You're tuning with an actual instrument. And I think tuning with an instrument that is also not a bassoon, it just opens your ears up a little bit more, I think, than playing with a synthesized sound or playing with, a synthesized MIDI bassoon sound or something. So playing with drones is a really good way to start hearing intonation better, especially in your individual practice. And you can use it as a reference, so for example, if I'm playing in C major, I will play my C major scale like really slowly to start with. And the first note, of course, is C. And if I'm, still kind of working on trying to improve how I'm hearing pitch, I would recommend intentionally playing C sharp or flat in comparison to the drone. So pushing it a little bit sharp, or pushing it or kind of relaxing a little bit and letting it go too flat, particularly when you go flat and then you bring it up to pitch, then you can really hear there's beats in the sound. You can hear, especially when you're going flat up to pitch, you can hear the beats in the sound, like it's unpleasant to listen to when it's out of tune. It's really unpleasant to listen to when it's really out of tune, and it gets a little less unpleasant, the closer you get into tune. But you want to get to a point where it's unpleasant to your ears unless it's perfectly in tune. So having that reference pitch of the drone and playing your scales is a good way to do it. I talked about C, the root pitch, bringing that in tune, but there's also the element of all of the other notes in C major that create different intervals with that C drone. So what does the D sound like in reference to the C? That's a major second interval. What does the E natural sound like to the drone, which is the major third? And the third of a scale, when you have an interval of a third, notes that are separated, that are a leap apart, I guess is another way you could put it, is the third is a good way to understand just intonation. In the world of intonation, there's something called equal temperament and there's something called just intonation. Equal temperament is like a piano, is how a piano is tuned. A piano is tuned to set pitches. You can't change the pitch of the piano unless you're a piano tuner who can, actually tighten and loosen the strings within the piano. But when you're just playing piano, you can't change the pitch of those notes. They are set, which is why it's frustrating as a wind player or a string player to play with the piano, because they can't change their pitch. You just have to bend to them. And if you're playing with a piano that hasn't been tuned recently, it may be really out of whack, and you have to make weird adjustments that put you out of tune in order to play in tune with the piano. But a piano that has recently been tuned and been tuned well is tuned in what's called equal temperament. All the notes are equidistant from each other in pitch, but the way that equal temperament works is that, to the human ear, a third, for example, on a piano does not sound as good as when you can adjust for what's called just tuning, what sounds good to the human ear on a wind instrument or a string instrument. Let me explain a little bit further. On a piano, if you play a C and an E, that's a major third. The pitches are what they are. They are technically they should be in green on tune with a tuner. A normal tuner is normally tuned to equal temperament. So the piano is going to play a C perfectly in tune with the tuner and an E perfectly in tune with the tuner. But the problem with that when it comes to wind and string playing, when we can adjust our pitches on the go, a major third sounds best when that third is a little bit low, when it's a little bit a few cents below what would be on green or in tune with a tuner. So that's why it's difficult playing with a pianist, because, a major third for them is set on green in tune, theoretically, and it may not sound as good to your ear. And you can try this with the drone as well. With the drone going on C and then you play an E, you will notice that if you play the E on green with the tuner, say you have the drone going in earbuds and you play the E with the tuner, the E will sound, it'll sound fine. It'll sound okay because we're used to this equal temperament. But when you lower the pitch of that third just a hair, just a little bit, you'll notice that the sound of the interval of your E with the drone C, when you hit that sweet spot of what just tuning, it sounds much better when the third is just a little bit low. Consequently, if you're playing a minor third, so in this case, if you're in C minor, it would be an E flat, would be the minor third. An E flat sounds best in a minor key, in a minor third situation, if it is a little bit high. I think it's like 14 cents high or something like that. You can mess around with that with a drone as well. So that complicates things. You might be like, what the heck is she talking about right now? And I hope I'm explaining this in a way that makes sense, but that's where tuning can get really complicated when it comes to wind playing, because we can make adjustments for just tuning. And there's other intervals as well. The fifth, so if you're in C major, C, and then the G is the fifth of C major, that sounds best when it's just a little bit wide, when the G is just a little bit sharp, like a couple cents. And there's other intervals. Every interval has kind of different, it sounds better when it's just a little bit higher than in tune or a little bit lower than in tune. And when you're playing in a wind setting, that is the ultimate goal. You want to play in just tuning, because to the human ear, those intervals sound the best when they're adjusted for that. But we always have to play this game of, what situation are we in? Are we in a situation where we're playing with fixed pitch instruments like pianos, percussion instruments and so on, where we have to basically play an equal temperament? Or are we playing in a wind setting where we can adjust for those intervals? So this has gotten into the weeds, I think more than I was meaning to, but that's just I just opened the can of worms for, how to start hearing intervals a little bit differently. And I think there's lots of information online and stuff if you want to dive into what how intervals sound best and what their pitch differentiation is and all that stuff. But that's about hearing pitch, and that takes years to develop. It's not something that you're just going to all of a sudden hear overnight. But when you're listening to other people play, whether you're listening to a live performance or a recording, really listen to their intonation. If you listen to a middle school band play, you're going to hear, if there's 20 people playing a note, there's going to be 20 different variations of that note, and you're going to hear how it kind of clashes, and it's kind of a messy, noisy sound, even though everybody's technically playing the same note. Whereas if you hear a professional band play that same, the same amount of people playing that same note, it's going to sound very pure and very clean when it's in unison. And that's the difference. That's how it comes across in a performance to an audience is, it's going to sound cleaner, crisper, more pure when everybody's in tune with each other. When it comes to your instrument tendencies, so the first step is hearing these pitches. The second step is accommodating for hearing these pitches on your instrument. And it really comes down to knowing your instrument tendencies. One of the most basic exercises that you can do for understanding your instrument's tendencies is to sit with a tuner, play every single note chromatically on your entire instrument. From the lowest note on bassoon, it's B flat, up to the highest note that you can play comfortably, and watch what the pitch does. Now, make sure that when you're doing this exercise, you're relatively warmed up, your instrument is warm, because when your instrument is cold versus when it's warm, the pitch is going to change. So when your instrument's warm and you're playing on a decent reed, play on your best reed, because in the most ideal situation, you want to know what your instrument tendencies are. So what are the tendencies of the low B flat on your bassoon? What are the tendencies of the high F on your bassoon? For most bassoonists, the tendency is for the low B flat to be sharp, and the tendency for that high F, the one that's above the staff, is to be a little flat. That's a really common bassoon tendency thing. But every instrument's different, every reed is different, every person is different. And you may have, variations on those tendencies. In general, on the bassoon, we tend to be sharp in the lower register. For a lot of people, the D below the staff is one of the most unstable and sharp notes on the bassoon. And so knowing that, when you go into situations where you're playing that low D, okay, it's going to tend sharp, so I'm going to have to open up a little bit more in the back of my throat and really think lower than where it wants to be. Because the other part of this is knowing your instrument tendencies is your instrument wants to place those notes at where they sort of naturally want to resonate on the instrument. And a good example of this is the G near the top of the bass clef staff on bassoon. The G sounds like it naturally wants to lean a little bit sharp. Like that's where the instrument wants to generally put it, unless you're manipulating it. You have to train yourself that even though it feels good to put that G a little bit sharp, because that's where the instrument kind of naturally wants to push it, you need to manipulate that G to sound good, a little bit flatter, so that it's in tune. And that takes some kind of awareness, of hearing what its tendencies are, and then retraining yourself to hear it so it sounds good in tune. So there's notes like that on the bassoon, and I think most instruments in general, where, your ear might push you towards one way or the other because maybe the tone is slightly better, but you also have to think about what does the pitch sound like. Tone and pitch are, they go together. It's if someone can technically play it in tune, but if they have a bad tone, it's still going to sound out of tune. So, just playing with a good sound in general is important when it comes to playing it in tune. So, I hope that gives you some ideas to think about intonation and practicing your intonation. Practice with a drone and your warm-ups for just hearing things better. Do that exercise where you're checking the intonation of every single note chromatically. And that's a really good starting place. And then just try to get yourself, when you're listening to other people play, really try to critically think about, is that really in tune? Who's sharp and who's flat? That's having those sort of thoughtful inquiries in your mind when you're listening can be really helpful.